if someone looks up David Baddiel on Wikipedia, the thumbnail sketch says satire, observational comedy, human interaction, sex, football, religion, which is a lot to get through.
Is that my employment?
It's your life. So we're going to get through as much of that as we can, which means we're going to be talking very, very fast. Let's begin with your time as a student. You studied English at Cambridge.
Yeah.
Was that always the plan?
No. So I was passing the chemistry thing on the way here, the faculty, and it did instantly make me think of my early childhood because my dad was a scientist. He did chemistry. He went to Imperial. He was a very working class bloke from Swansea, and he was a frightening man. My dad, not terribly frightening, but he was just bad tempered in the way that a lot of 1970s dads were. I remember at his funeral, I said the thing about my dad. He was a guy who liked football, science, and shouting, "Who the fucking hell is this now?" every time the phone rang. And so I was a bit frightened by that, and I was particularly frightened when, and if I wrote a biopic of my life, which I don't think I'm ever going to do, but if I did, I should know the name of this man, but I don't. A teacher at my school came up to me when I was about 15 and said, "Matt, you seem to be choosing science subjects for your A-levels, and you're rubbish at them. You're terrible. You get C's and D's, whereas you get A's for English and A's for history. You should be doing art subjects." And it had been the case in my house that the default was so much that proper intellectual work only really happens in the sciences. A thing that I believe that all people who work in the arts actually secretly believe. But I found that difficult to do, and I went and told my dad with some trepidation that I was going to do art subjects, and he said it's a waste of a brain. And that shows you that parenting was very different in the 1970s in lots of ways. But the point about all that is that I was never entirely sure exactly what I wanted to do academically, and I ended up becoming very interested in comedy, and at the time, which was the early 80s, the only thing I knew about comedy, and this was to change very much as the 80s progressed, was that the Cambridge Footlights was where Monty Python and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and those people had come from. My brother had played me a cassette tape of something which I don't know how many people in this audience will have heard, the older people will have done, called Derek and Clive, which was a kind of bootleg tape that Peter Cook and Dudley Moore had done when they were drunk. And it would now lead to just instant cancellation for the two of them, but I thought it was incredible when I was 14. I thought it was like punk rock except comedy, and so I thought I'll go to Cambridge because that's where they went, and so my interest was being that. I did in fact end up as vice president of the Cambridge Footlights, but unusually for someone who did that, because most people who do that end up doing very badly. I mean, this sounds like a huge flex and annoying, but I did do well academically as well. I got what in Cambridge is called double first. Is that a thing in Oxford? Is that a thing in Oxford?
Not as much.
Right. Okay. Well, it was a thank you. It was a thing at Cambridge, and I ended up afterwards thinking, what am I going to do now? And one thing, I don't want to go. This is a long comedy diversion, but it used to be the case when Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie and people like that and Emma Thompson were in Footlights, which was like 1981, that you could kind of come straight out of Cambridge and you'd get a show on BBC Two. By the time I came out of Footlights, 1986, that was totally not the case. Everyone hated people who had gone to the Cambridge Footlights and just wanted like alternative comedians. So I had to go on the London Cabaret Circuit, which I actually was really pleased that I did in the end. I sort of really loved being a stand-up on the London Cabaret Circuit, but I didn't have any money. And so to get money, I mean, this sounds bad actually, now I say it in an academic environment, but you could do that then, and I got a grant to do a PhD at London University in the same subject that you do.
Yeah.
I think it was on the Victorian sexuality, Victorian sexuality and literature primarily the sort of fetishization of innocence in Victorian, male Victorian novelists. And I did 90% of that PhD, and then got a show on TV and scrapped it.
And do you see the influence of that PhD on anything you've done there when it comes to innocence and innocence being corrupted or innocence being tested in some way? Is a lot of comedy about that idea of innocence being restored?
Maybe. I mean, the PhD itself, my grandma, who was from Germany, was a refugee from Nazism, and really hated me being a comedian. She just wanted me to do a respectable job. And even though she'd probably prefer me to be a dentist or something like that, or an accountant, she thought, oh, if he's a PhD, he'll be Dr. Baddiel, that'd be great. And then she was so annoyed that never happened. She was really pissed off with me. So I don't know, I mean, I think that if, when I go back to that, I occasionally look at it, it's really out of date. It uses the word discourse far too much. It's a lot about Foucault, and so
You're a King's boy.
I was King's. It was the 80s. I couldn't help myself. But I think I don't know. I'm very interested in childhood. That sounds terrible. I'm very interested in it in terms of comedy.
Yes.
In terms of comedy, I have this notion, which is that there's lots of younger people in this audience, but the older people would tell you that adulthood, we're all just winging adulthood. No one knows how to be an adult. There's only one person in the entire world whose soul matches up with the age he in fact is, and his name is Michael Gove. Right? No one else in the world feels the age they actually are. And one thing about being a comedian that always interests me in History Today, that we talked about, now many of you know about this, but it's a sketch that me and Rob Newman did on the Mary Rice Experience, which was very successful, where we played two old history professors, in fact, who would start off by talking about something very distinguished and intellectual, and then just say, you see that piece of flog on the floor, that's you, that is. And just slag each other off like primary school children. And what that was just doing, it was stripping away the facade of adulthood. And I've always been interested in that, because even though I have ended up doing stuff which is, I guess, at some level quite cerebrally difficult, at heart, I'm very interested in the fact that authenticity lies somewhere else.
Yeah, we might come back to that, because one might say that Lauren Hardy and Buster Keaton and a lot of clowns, some comedians, are basically kids. They are children trapped into the bottle of innocence.
No, exactly. I think all comedy, not all comedy, there's other types, satire maybe not, but a lot of comedy, especially slapstick, a lot of types of stand-up are about the refusing the dignity, the apparent dignity of adulthood.
Okay, we'll come back to that. We have to talk about football briefly,
Do we? Okay.
not least because our team's playing each other
I know, it really pissed me off.
tonight. I know, me too.
Yeah.
However, we'll go for this.
Okay.
One image that many people here will still have of you is Euro 96, 76,000 people singing along to you and Frank Skinner and your anthem, Three Lions. That's a kind of story.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, so
not a very happy ending yet.
Well, yeah. I mean, actually, so when I was asked to do this, I did say, what can I talk about? And I am very interested in story. I'm very interested in storytelling. The fact that I've chosen many different media to work in seems to me like people do say sometimes in interviews or whatever, oh, you do all these different things. And I tend to say they're not different things, they're just all storytelling. It's not like I'm a comedian and a plumber. Right? I just tell stories in different media, and one of the things is Three Lions is definitely a story, and it's interesting that it's a story because before Three Lions, every football song, with the possible exception of World in Motion by New Order, but that wasn't really a story either, had just been an incorrect story because every England song before that was We're Gonna Win. Right? Back home, we'll be singing all that rubbish, right? It was always we're going to win. And it was wrong. It was told the wrong story. So when me and Frank Skinner wrote the lyrics to Three Lions, I think I said, let's try and tell the real story of what it feels like to be an England fan, which is, of course, that we lose. Right? That we're shit and we lose, but there's a magical thinking thing that goes on, which is despite that, we think this time we might not, right? And we have enough shards, I think T.S. Eliot said, I have short the fragments of my ruins, we have enough shards of mini success in 1966 to hope against hope that this time we are going to. And so that is there's a moment, the way that Three Lions works is it begins with the singers, me and Frank, I hate to refer to myself as a singer, but nonetheless, me and Frank singing about, England are going to throw it away, they're going to blow it away, everyone knows. And then Frank says, but I know they can play because I remember, right? And then that tackle by Moore, and when Lineker scored, Bobby belting the ball and Nobby dancing. And so, just very quickly, this is actually what happened, is me and Frank are there on the second game that England play, It's England-Scotland. England hasn't played well at that tournament, but the football fans amongst you and the older ones will know Euro 96 started disappointingly. It almost brilliantly mirrored what Three Lions is about. And then, on that particular game, Gary McAllister missed a penalty, the ball went out, Gazza scored one of the greatest goals of all time, then we won 2-0, and then the sun came out, and then a man, again whose name I don't know, this is really bad of me, the DJ at Wembley, against the wishes of the FA, who said that song is too partisan, put on Three Lions, and 76,000 England fans, including not the Scottish fans, just joined in. Just joined in. We had no idea at that point in time, me and Frank Skinner and Ian Brody of the Lightning Seeds, that song had chimed so deeply with England fans. And people say that the best day of your life is when your children are born. Fuck that. That was the best day of my life. It's absolutely true.
I've never seen, I've seen the footage several times, I've never seen anyone who's happy.
No, it was
as you there.
Well, it was really amazing, partly because, like, what do you do this for, I guess? And at some level you do it because you hope your stuff will be popular, but you hope it will mean something to people. Now, a lot of the time, I would say, in show business, for want of a better word, also in literary world, the way that you get told that your stuff is valuable is not always wrong, but it's in a top-down way. It's awards, right? And it's really the machinery of whatever that world is saying we're going to anoint this. Three Lions is the opposite of that. It was the most grassroots way of appreciating a thing that you've done. I mean, actually, it got terrible reviews when it came out. All the music critics thought it wasn't cool. And it isn't cool. It's not a cool song, it's a sentimental song. Deliberately so. Because football is about enormous sentiment.
Yeah. I want to come back to that idea of crossing boundaries between different styles, but also different classes because, and ages, because that's something your writing is clearly interesting. But moving on to printed stories, though, as a lot of people here will know, one of your parallel careers has been as a writer of novels. When you started out, and were there particular writers that you were trying to steer away from, or trying to emulate, or echo? I think in particular the fact that you're a dual British-American citizen. Did you think of your own writing as being sort of dual British and American?
Well, I was very obsessed, and still am fairly obsessed with the great American novelists. To some extent, the ones who are now considered the great male narcissists, they're all incredibly out of fashion. Updike, Bellow, Roth, those people. And I wrote my last literary novel, which was quite a while ago now, which is called The Death of Eli Gold, is, I think, predictive in its own way, in that it's called The Death of Eli Gold because Eli Gold in that novel is a mashup, a mad mashup of kind of Bellow and Norman Mailer and Roth and all those people, and he is actually dying in the novel, but he's dying culturally.
And Roth
as well.
has a walk-on part.
Yeah, Roth does have a walk-on part. Yeah, I don't know if Philip ever read it. But he's dying because the notion of greatness, particularly of male greatness, is dying in our culture, and not in a way before time, I think. And particularly in that novel, there was something else, which, blowing my own trumpet here, but it was a bit predictive, which was it had a terrible personal life. The way he treated women, Eli Gold, was particularly bad. And throughout the sort of 80s, 70s, 80s and 90s, that meant nothing in terms of our estimation of genius. Now that's completely changed now. People will criticise Picasso now properly for the way that he was about women and whatever, and I think that's an interesting conversation. But I guess when I wrote this book, which is my first novel, there's an element of reaching particularly towards Updike, who I still is my essential lodestar for great prose writing. But it's also influenced by Martin Amis, it's also influenced by Kingsley Aid. It's a kind of British comic novel. It's really a Roman McClef as well. Time for Bed. I'm writing a memoir at the moment, which is basically I did a show about my family, which is about, it was called My Family, a sitcom, and I did it in the West End and then kind of all over the world. And that was about, principally about my mum. My mum had an affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman in the 70s, and then turned our entire life over to golf. And this was at a time when my dad had been made redundant, in fact, and so we didn't have like much money, but we would always have a statue of Lee Trevino somewhere. It was very, very weird and obvious that my mum was obsessed with golf because she was having an affair with this guy, but somehow my dad didn't know. It was really brilliant in its comedy at some level. And so all of that is in there in some way.
And you know Buckeye is obsessed by golf as well.
Yeah, I did know that, yeah, but not in the way I...
Oh,
No, I fucking hate golf. Updike loves golf, yeah.
Do you know that too?
Yeah, alright, I haven't read from this novel for ages. I remember reading through it when it came out. But I thought it might be interesting to read this bit, partly because I at the time, in 1995, or whenever this novel was written, I was totally mainly known as comedian and the TV sketch comedian. And in terms of telling stories across different media, this bit is quite like a sketch, I think. But it also really fits into the novel. And I think the way that it's written, even though I probably write it slightly differently now, shows a kind of bridge between the idea of a comedy idea of what's happening and the way that it still has novelistic features. So in this bit, Gabriel, who's the main character, who's sort of about 30, is going to see his grandma, who's called Eva Baumgart, who lives in a Jewish old age home. The nurse that opens the door is a tired-looking woman in her late 30s. Yes, she says suspiciously. I've come to see Eva Baumgart. She nods, withdrawing to let me in. She's upstairs visiting the Frindle sisters, room 7. Oh no. The Frindle sisters are two 93-year-old twins who are convinced, completely wrongly, that Liv to Shem House is one of those old age homes when the staff beat up the residents. The nurse points me in the direction of the lift, but I take the stairs, because I can. Outside room 7, I can hear my grandmother talking loudly in German. I knock on the door. Ja? I open. As the Frindle sisters have often told me, all their belongings are holed up in a flat in Acton, and so their room is pure institutional, just a linoleum cell with a sink at one end. The two of them are identical in every respect, except the older one, Lydia, I think, has got a wobbly brown mole, large enough to hang your coat on, in the hollow next to her right nostril. Her and her sister Lottie have both worn only black since their father died in 1952. Now they sit very close together on two school classroom-style wooden chairs, set neatly in between their twin lilac-quilted beds. On the right bed, hair completely white, dressed navy blue as always, sits my grandma, her feet not touching the floor. Hello, Mutti, I say. She looks up. For a few seconds, her face is ugly, distorted by fear and loathing, by memories of other large, indistinct men who smashed through the doors of her parents' home. Then light finally squeezes through the interstices of her cataracts, and her face clears into a smile, an incredibly welcoming smile. Gabby, she says, and forgetting she's 83, makes to leap up. So nice of you to come. I go over to help her up. I'm only 5'9", but even without her natural stoop, Mutti comes up only to my solar plexus. I kiss her on her softly wrinkled cheek. How are you? She says. She doesn't wait for a reply. Well, that was a quick response to my letter, I must say. Lottie, Lydia, es ist Gabby, my ankle. Hello, says Lydia. Hello, says Lottie. Can you help us? Says Lydia. They come into her room without knocking. They don't tell us when our friends have telephoned. Don't worry, says my grandma to me in what I suppose you would call a whisper, but as she's almost completely deaf, it's more like a very breathy shout. It's not true. I know this, but not as if it's news. Well, ladies, she continues, if my Gabby is here, I must go. But all her things are in Acton. Well, goodbye, says my grandma, tugging at my sleeve. I back out the door, smiling vacuously. But Ava, young man, you must help us. We begin to move down the corridor. Holding her arm, I have to force myself to take extra small steps to keep my speed down. She tucks and shakes her head. Those women, I don't know what they want, but I'm so pleased you came. What? They won't let us use our own toilet! I turn round. I can just see the edge of Lydia's Zimmer frame poking round her door. Come on, my grandma says, her face set. We move off at about 10 yards an hour. Lydia emerges from her doorway at about 2. Perhaps the slowest chase in the history of chase sequences is on. They won't do Lottie's laundry! The William Tell overture plays in my head. It's all I can do not to turn round and stand waiting for her, and then when she gets within an inch of me, run off again, holding Mutti above my head, waving. 2.5 minutes later, and we're just about round the corner. Lydia has gained no ground on us, and I have a terrible feeling as I look back towards their door that I can see the first spoke of Lottie's wheelchair. It's like some terrible 4x400 metres. Quick, says Mutti, absurdly, as to be honest, I could go quick. The lift is in sight. It's just off the North Circular Road, you could go there tomorrow. We're there. I press the button. The silver circle lights up. Stupidly, I press it again a few more times, as if this is going to make any difference to the lift. Come on, we've only got 35 minutes. It arrives just as Lydia makes the corner. No, she says, seeing us go into the lift. And I feel a bit bad, really, because even if, as my grandma says, it's not true, it's probably just Lydia Frindle's way of saying, please stay.
So that's a sketch with a voiceover.
Yeah.
What does that tell us then about the boundaries between different kinds of storytelling? Especially when it comes to supposedly high status forms like the novel, and then popular forms like, say, sketches.
Yeah. So it's true what Marion said earlier, that I think I don't recognise the boundaries between different types of storytelling. And to some extent that's a technical thing. I just do believe that if you can tell a story, if you're good at structuring, which is what the primary thing about storytelling is about, and language, if you're good with those things, then you should be able to tell a story in many different ways. But there is also a kind of more reactive social thing going on, which is that I perceive that some art forms are considered by the gatekeepers of culture to be higher than others, and that idea that you should stick, as it were, to your lane as a storyteller has a sort of snobbish element to it. And I noticed this very much when I first started to write novels. I wasn't the first ever comedian to write a novel, but it was certainly the case that there was a pushback against that of, well, I don't know if sketch comedians should be writing novels. And there's a number of things wrong with that. Number one, in 1979, when the Comedy Store opened, comedians in this country stopped being the kind of like big men in bow ties just telling an Englishman, an Irishman, a Scotsman went into a pub jokes and became storytellers. Alexei Sayle, who was the godfather of alternative comedy in this country, became someone talking about his life and writing his own stories and his own funny stories, but saying them in an oral tradition out loud. Now, as such, that doesn't seem to me to be necessarily not a good grounding for writing a longer form story, I think. But then there was this other thing that seemed to be going on there a bit, which was, what it is that you are allowed to do. So it seems to me that I don't see that the novel, I like novels a lot, but I don't see that it's a higher art form than the sketch or even the stand-up comedy. If you think of like great sketches, for example, Mitchell and Webb's Nazi sketch. How many people know that sketch, right? In Mitchell and Webb's sketch, David Mitchell, who is from Oxford, or he went to Cambridge, plays a Nazi who is troubled, and you do know this, but he's troubled, and eventually Robert Webb, who's just shouting about, when we're going to take this front and that front, David Mitchell interrupts him and says, are we the baddies, right? And it's such an incredibly profound and comic question about how bad people never understand that they are bad people, that I think, how is that not as high an art form as whatever it is that's won the Booker? Or indeed, Peep Show, or, Monty Python, or whatever else it might be. There's also a slightly weird other thing, by the way, which is when, as I used to occasionally get, this sense of like, well, you should just stay in your lane, you're a comedian, you shouldn't write a novel. I always thought that was nothing to do really with comedy. It was to do with fame. Because I noticed that when Magnus Mills is a very good writer, he wrote a book called The Restraint of Beasts, which was nominated for the Booker about 20 years ago, I think. Very good book. But one thing that was totally a plus for Magnus Mills is that he'd been a bus driver. That's what he did before he was a writer. And that was massively good for him. Had he been on a reality show called The Bus Driver, and he'd become a famous bus driver, there's no way in the world he would have got nominated for the Booker. And so there's a kind of weird thing of like, well, here's your corner, and we know you for that, and we don't want you to move out of that. And I was always resistant to that.
And in terms of connections then between the things that you've done, so you're interested in football, there are plays, there are musicals, there are events like this, there's stand-up, there's social media. One thing you've heard say about social media is that it involves people sharing a common experience.
Sometimes. Not
Or
always.
being divided by it. But,
Yeah, divided by it often on social media.
but you might say much the same about all those other things that you're interested in. It involves people sharing or trying to share common experiences. But then writing presumably is a bit different to that.
Well, yes and no. I think that's a really good question. So, in terms of comedy, at least, an observational comedy, which is what sort of replaced the idea of just telling old jokes. Observational comedy is about trying to find communality, right? People laugh at stuff because they think, well, that is something that I've experienced. But what is an interesting thing with that is that occasionally it does happen that younger comedians will write to me or talk to me about it. And one thing I've noticed, this might be true not just of comedy but of writing in general, is that when you first try to imagine that, what you might do is a sort of retro-engineering thing, by which I mean you'll think, what is it that we all might find funny? Because you're trying to appeal to a wide audience, right? That's wrong, I think. It's wrong to try and look for some community chest of comedy, of comic stuff. That's how you end up with hack comedy. Instead, what I think, and this is what I realised after a while, what you should look for is what is most idiosyncratic about yourself and your own voice. What is the most idiosyncratic thing about yourself and your own life? When I did that show about my mum and the fact that she had an affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman and turned our lives over to golf, no one had had that experience. But after the show, many, many people came up to me and said, oh, my mum was exactly like that. By which they don't mean that my mum did that. What they mean is that the sort of strangeness of family life, which is true for everyone, is conveyed through the specificity of my experience. And for me, specificity became very important. It became like, that's how you actually channel the universal.
Is that then true of the non-fiction as well? Books like Tuesday and Counts, is that trying to find a middle ground between the commonality and the specificity of your experience?
I don't know. Maybe in that particular book. I mean, that relates to something else, which is, again, it comes back a little bit to what I said about not going for a top-down, retro-engineered idea of what you should write about. So you should never, in my opinion, think, okay, what is it that the world needs to write about? Even though you might end up there by a different place, you should look inside yourself and think, what is it that I feel the need to write about, and hope that that is what the world needs to hear. And so, you know, to choose two completely different examples, when I wrote my first children's novel, my son, who was then 8, said to me one day, oh, why doesn't Harry Potter run away from the Dursleys and try and find some better parents? And I actually know why Harry Potter doesn't do that. Harry Potter doesn't do that because J.K. Rowling wants to have him in the most mundane, depressing environment so that Hogwarts is more magical. But I wasn't interested in the first part, I was interested in the second part, which is, a world in which children can choose their own parents. Has anyone written that, is what I thought immediately. That's a children's novel, right? It bothered me a bit that the idea came from my son. But not enough, because the sliver of ice inside me made me think that's a good idea for a children's story. And what I mean by that is that I was immediately engaged in the possibility and the potential of story at that point. So similarly, when the TLS, who were trying to write, they were trying to publish, I don't know if they'd done other ones actually, they were intending, Stig Abel, who was mentioned, came to me, he was editing the TLS, and said, we're trying to recreate the kind of Orwell tradition of writing short political books about, things that are happening in the UK or wherever at the moment. Do you want to write one? It can kind of be about anything. And I instantly said, I want to write about the demotion of Jews and Jewish representation and Jewish inclusion within the discussion about identity politics. And that wasn't because I looked at the world and thought it was inside me. I mean, also I felt it to be in the world, but it was more of an urgent thing that felt it was in me. And that's how I would always look for that spark.
Should we hear a bit from it?
We can do. So this is an interesting bit, I think. This is the bit I tend to read from Jews Don't Count. But it is also useful for our purposes, I guess, because, you know, you write a book about anti-Semitism, and I think most people would think that might be quite an academic thing, or it might be quite a historical thing, or whatever. This is a polemic, and it's a polemic which comes in a way from stand-up. I guess the first thing I did when I came out of university, and I was doing it at university, was stand-up. And so when I write even about a serious subject like this, it's still in my voice, and it still has that element of vernacular that is important to me. So this, to go back to something else that you were talking about, is about football. And I begin this book by about 12 examples of what the book begins about, and then tries to examine why that is, which is within the context of a society that is moving more and more successfully and usefully towards trying to protect minorities from abuse and trying to include minorities in the conversation. That seems to be missing in one case. An example from my sporting life. In 2008, I was sitting as usual on a Saturday afternoon with my brother Ivor, watching Chelsea at their home ground Stamford Bridge. We'd been going for many years, and by this point sat in the Upper East Stand. Chelsea were playing Aston Villa. The game was dull. On the big screen, a score came up of another match. Chelsea's London rivals Tottenham were being beaten by a considerably less glamorous club, Hull. The bored crowd picked up on this and started chanting, "We hate Tottenham and we hate Tottenham." Then, with wearying predictability, this mutated into the crowd chanting the word Yiddo. For those who don't know about this phenomenon, the Tottenham Hotspur Football Club is located in an area of London that is fairly well populated by Jews. For this reason, Spurs fans both self-identify and are identified by others as a Jewish club, even though the vast majority of their fans are not Jewish, and this leads to various chants based around the word Yid. Those who do know about it are still generally confused, as they tend to think it's all just Spurs fans chanting this word positively. It isn't. It is also chanted by the fans of Chelsea, Arsenal, West Ham, and other clubs at Spurs fans, menacingly, horribly, along with associated anti-Semitic chants. Spurs are on their way to Auschwitz, for example, and hissing to simulate the noise of gas chambers. On this particular afternoon, the chanting of the word Yiddo by about 20,000 people was joined by one particular fan about 10 rows behind us, deciding to shout repeatedly, "Fuck the fucking Yids, fuck the fucking Yids." And then just to make clear that by Yids, he didn't just mean Spurs fans, that became, "Fuck the fucking Jews, fuck the fucking Jews." This went on for some time. Me and Ivor, my brother, looked at each other. Ivor said, "What should we do?" I shrugged. So then my brother, bless him, got up, turned round, and told the bloke to shut up. The man replied in the classic mode, "No, you fucking shut up." Ivor said, "No, you fucking shut up." And then miraculously he did. The racist shut up. Ivor sat down and said, "I think I'm going to cry." By the time this happened, we had sat, well stood and then sat, listening to this stuff at Stamford Bridge for over 30 years. Over that period, the culture around racism in football changed immeasurably. In the 1970s, football fandom was unbelievably racist, and immense strides were made to eradicate it over the next decades by organisations like Kick It Out. By 2008, the world had definitely moved on. So much so that the Chelsea programme that day contained a very clear message that any racist abuse heard in the stands of matches would lead to immediate intervention by stewards and a life ban for the abuser concerned. Well, not any racist abuse, it turns out. No steward intervened when this happened, and no life ban was imposed on the man shouting, "Fuck the fucking Jews." The world had moved on, but it seems that it had forgotten something. It had left one racism behind. And the point about that story, which is a story, is not that there was an anti-Semite, a racist at a football match. Sadly, those people still exist in those spaces. The point is that those people are controlled now, monitored now, and shut down, which is a very good thing, but somehow not in this particular case. Somehow the racism is inaudible. in this particular case.
And that scene and your brother then appeared in the documentary, the Channel 4 documentary.
Yeah, we retold that story in the documentary.
That's right. And I just wonder, what are some of the challenges there in taking a book which you yourself describe as a polemic, written in one voice, your voice, and turning it into a piece of TV which inevitably involves lots of different voices, not all of whom are going to be agreeing with you.
Yeah.
How does that process work?
Well, in that particular case, it was kind of slightly weird because, I mean, Channel 4 really wanted to do Jews Don't Count as a documentary. I wasn't sure about it, partly because the book seemed to be doing the work it was trying to do, and I didn't want to sort of get in the way of that, but also exactly what you just said, which is most documentaries tend to be kind of balanced, I guess, right? And I didn't want it to be balanced. It's a polemic. It's meant to be about, like, me as a Jew saying this voice doesn't seem to be being heard in this conversation. So I need to say that, right? So in the end, that is really what that is. It's other voices, mainly confirming my voice, with the exception of Miriam Margolis, who is an interesting thing because, you know, not actually kind of really wanting to get into such in a big way, but, you know, one of the things we talked about was Israel, and my position was always, and still remains so, that you know, Jews are expected to have this very, very sort of strong connection to that country, either for, or in the case of Miriam, against. And I think that's a foreign country. It's a foreign country, right? And no other minority is expected to answer for the actions of a foreign country. And that seems to be itself a Jews don't count phenomenon. And so in dealing with that, I thought it would be very interesting on someone who doesn't feel that, which was Miriam, who feels, I mean, she was clear about it. What's weird about that conversation is that she is very anti-Zionist, but she's the one in that conversation saying that she feels a very strong connection to Israel.
Absolutely. And think about collaboration more generally. Is that something that you enjoy? I'm thinking about the way that The Infidel was first written as a movie, and then it was turned into a musical.
Yeah. So The Infidel, everyone doesn't know, it's a film I did in 2010. With Omid Jalili in it, as a brilliant British-Iranian comedian. It's about a Muslim who discovers that he was biologically born Jewish and then has a kind of comedy nervous breakdown about that. And I don't know whether I could make it now, to be honest, but I think it wouldn't be a bad thing to show now, because at the heart of it is a very strong, I'm not an atheist, but I don't know another word for this, kind of interfaith message, which is that, you know, there'll always be differences, but actually there's an enormous amount of similarities between cultures, particularly those two cultures, more than I even realised until I wrote that. But in terms of collaboration, I love collaborating. I don't know if people love collaborating with me. Because, to be honest with you, every single director that I've had has got really angry with me. I'll tell you a story, actually, which is probably the director of that film is called Joshua Pignonesi. He's a really good director. He said to me at some point during that film, he said, can you come with me? Well, I need to talk to you. And I thought, fine, because I was on set every day. And then he kept on walking, and he kept on walking. I thought, where are we going? Where are we going? And eventually we found ourselves on some waste ground, about 10 minutes away from the set. And then I realised, oh, he wants me to be far enough away to shout at me, so that no one can hear. I mean, he might be far away to kill me, but it was like a place The Sopranos would be. But anyway, he was so angry with me. And the reason that he was angry, and I understand why, it's fair enough, but there's a thing about comedy, which is specific to comedy, I would say, which is that if you, I don't know if anyone here is involved with comedy in the Oxford Review or just doing stand-up or whatever, but my own feeling about comedy is it's not quite like other art forms. And that's partly because, unlike other art forms, it's a bit more like sport, right? Because basically a joke lands or it doesn't, and it's clear. Whereas any other art form, you can kind of get away with it. There's an abstract ambiguity about whether or not a play is good, isn't it? Or a painting is good. Because no one makes a noise, really, that says this is good and it has worked. People just look at it and then critics tell you, in a slightly annoying way, that it's good or bad. Comedy's not really like that. And I can tell you something, which is a joke, if you say it wrong, if you say the wrong stresses on a joke, or indeed if you film a scene wrong that's got a reveal gag in it, it's not like drama, where you could film a scene 20 different ways and the 20 different directors and they're all equally valid. If you film a comedy scene wrong, it's like playing the wrong notes. It won't be funny anymore.
So do you get involved in the editing? As that's the timing of the joke.
That's when a director is really annoying. Because directors, I think, oh, he's been incredibly annoying, he's such a twat, but we'll be all right in the edit. And then I say, I'm coming to the edit. It really annoys them. But it's ridiculous, I have to say, that people who do write stuff, or present documentaries, or whatever else it might be, that is their work, that they then aren't in the edit. Because for me, editing is absolutely of a piece with writing and performing. It's clearly as important.
So going back to social media, which we touched on briefly. So in another BBC documentary, Social Media Angle and Us, you say that online platforms like Twitter, X, are full of, you say, conflict and rage, but also you say you're an addict. You say you're an addict because they give you, and it's your phrase, a captive audience. Presumably then that allows you to try out jokes, try out material. Do you find then that the nature of the material changes when you're trying to fit a punchline to something really punchy, like 280 characters? Do you find that...
well, so firstly, I'm not as much an addict as I was.
Okay.
I should say, partly because, Twitter, X or whatever has so turned to shit. It's so become appalling. It's an appalling space now. And actually, interestingly enough, I did think of it to some extent as a way I could talk about ideas, but also as a space for comedy.
Okay. And
I did a whole show, as I've done these 3 one-man shows that I'm actually recording at the Royal Court in March over the last 10 years, and one of them was called Trolls, Not the Dolls, and it was about my notion that trolls are like hecklers, right? So, and I show in that show, it's difficult without the screen, I use a screen, but I'll give you an example. I remember someone said to me a typical thing, they said something like about me being privileged, and they spelt it with an A. And I said, oh, yeah, it's true, I'm so privileged, I know how to spell it. And then someone else said, I remember on top of that, oh, calling out spelling mistakes is so 2015. I said, you spelled so wrong. and for me, that is dealing with hecklers online, right? Because actually the way you deal with hecklers, by the way, if anyone is a comedian here, is you never get angry. People get angry on social media, that's obviously wrong. My experience in comedy tells me, no, what you do is you agree with the heckler, and then you take them down. I was going to say him, it probably always is him. You take them down by agreeing with them, by not really agreeing with them, or whatever. And so, but now I don't do it anymore. And in fact, when I do that show, when I record it, it's going to be a bit out of date, because it's too mad a platform now to do that. But just one thing I wanted to pick up on, which I did talk about in that documentary a bit, but I think is incredibly important. It's not that important for storytelling, but I think it is important socially, which is that documentary was about anger on social media, and it is my feeling that the reason that people are so angry on social media is that it's not a marketplace of ideas, social media. It claims to be that, but it isn't. What is it? It's a marketplace of identity. And people imagine that their identity is their opinions. And the problem with that is that we exist in a performative space with those opinions which become identity. And therefore, when people are saying who they are, and that might be whatever, I'm an anti-vax or whatever, how do you create your identity in a way that feels powerful and strong on social media? You do it in opposition. You do it by saying, I hate everyone who is not me. I hate everyone who has got different opinions to me. And that is very problematic. It's particularly problematic because it's performative. I was talking to Frank Skinner a couple of days ago, and he was talking about he used to work in a factory. He said that there was a foreman there who, if he wanted to call someone out, tell someone off, he would take them into his office and do it privately, and people were all right with that. And then a new foreman appeared who would shout at people on the factory floor. And people would feel humiliated and get really angry and upset. And that's what social media is like.
So people turn themselves into characters on social media?
I think so, personas.
Does that mean then that social media is changing the way that we understand that we consume story?
Well, I think sometimes that's brilliant, by the way. Certainly in comedy, I think that there's a woman on social media who does a character of her German mother. Do you know who I'm talking about, anyone? She's just totally brilliant. And I, have never really got it together to do comedy or Instagram reels, and probably never will because I'm just too old now. But I still look at that and think this is the future. This is clearly where comedy and story, because it's a story as well, is going. And I think that, that fragmented thing is, a lot of people worry about it because they think it's a very short thing, and it does suggest a problem for long-term storytelling, long-form storytelling, like what's going to happen to the novel or the long play. They don't seem to be dying out, and also television is getting longer and longer and longer, as are films, in fact. Maybe in response, I haven't really thought that through, but it might be in response to the fractional hit of things that you see on social media. But some of that stuff is really good. I don't agree with people who just think, oh, Instagram reels, they're just rubbish. Because apart from anything, I really like cats. If you like cats as much as I do, then you can't really complain about Instagram reels.
So, one of the ways of thinking now about storytelling across different media, in the way that we have, is that it's a kind of translation.
Yeah.
It's a way of translating between ideas between different forms of media. And there's an example actually from your own book, The God Desire, and also your play, God's Dice. They both involve a version of the same line, which is, a close friend once said to me, but don't you want to believe in God? I said yes, desperately. That's why I know he doesn't exist. Same line, very different kind of settings for it. So, do you think that idea, does an idea change its shape or its freight when you shift it from one form, one medium to another one? Or is an idea an idea?
Okay, so I don't know. So I wrote a play called God's Dice, which was on just before the pandemic, and it's about a sort of slightly, about an academic actually, a slightly tired physics academic, who one day, a young woman turns up in his lecture, and after the lecture she asks him a question about entanglement. And I don't know if there's any physics people in here, but I don't think I'm going to try and explain entanglement at the subatomic level, but she explains it. I mean, very, very briefly, it involves the fact that two subatomic particles, if they're paired together, you can take one of those subatomic particles and send it 200 light years away, and they will still be paired together. They will still rotate, they will spin in opposite directions. And this woman talks about this to the physicist, and the physicist says, yeah, explains it, and then says, is that your question? And she says, no, my question is, if I'm to believe that, I may as well believe in God, mightn't I? And I think I wrote that because something else was in me, which is I am like really fundamentalist atheist, but I'm an old atheist because I acknowledge within myself, which most atheists don't, Bertrand Russell didn't, Christopher Hitchens didn't, a desire that there should be a God. In fact, I believe that the desire that there should be a God is what creates God, and is the building block of my atheism. A kind of depressive thing, which is I know how much I would like there to be a God. I know how much I would like to live on after I'm dead. I know how much there should be a witness to the world, and that there should be universal justice. All those things, they don't exist. So we have to believe that they exist, thus we've created and projected a narrative, a story of it, into the sky, or wherever else it might be, that you believe that God is. I wrote that as a play, and then I wrote a polemic, well not really a polemic, it's more of a philosophical essay, God Desire, about why I believe God doesn't exist, and use it again, although I then got into a whole thing about I had to explain that it's from a play, and that it was, I actually really wanted to use it as the quote, as the epigraph, but I couldn't use an epigraph from my own play as a book, because that was just too Alan Partridge. I guess one thing I'm interested in terms of specificity is I am a Jewish atheist, right? I've written a book about antisemitism, I feel very strongly that I'm Jewish, and people don't get that, or some people don't get that, Jews get it, but some people don't get it. I can tell you a very quick story that I think is in the God Desire, which is, it is the case that about 50% of Jews are atheists, and I thought, well, that's quite a lot, I wonder why that is. But I use it occasionally to get out of things I'm asked to do by the Jewish community. So a rabbi once called me up, my local rabbi, who obviously I never met because I'm an atheist, but he called me up. I don't know how he got my number, it's because we control the world, I don't know. And he phoned me up and he said, can you come and light the menorah, the candelabra that Jews light at Hanukkah outside the synagogue this year, and I didn't want to do it. So I played what I thought was my trump card. I said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, Rabbi, but I'm an atheist." He said, "So am I." I thought, blimey, it's more widespread than I realised. But the nuance, the specificity is what I'm interested in, because I wanted to talk about in that book how there's some connection, some strange connection, between the fact that I want there to be a God and I come from a minority. Because I know there isn't a God. But unlike Christopher Hitchens, unlike Bertrand Russell, unlike Richard Dawkins, I know how much my identity is connected to centuries of tradition and suffering and defiance that are associated with religion.
This is going to sound like a huge kind of gear change, but I wonder whether that importance of specificity also stretches to your writing for children, or whether in fact it's especially important when you're writing for children. And if there are then things that translate across from some of the things we've been talking about, the polemics and the stage plays and so on, into the fiction for children.
Maybe. I mean, with the children's books, as I said earlier, when Ezra, my son, said that thing about Harry Potter, it felt to me like the most important thing was that feels to me pregnant with story. The idea of a world in which children can choose their own parents. And at that point, I mean, this is an absolutely true thing. I've been asked many times, like, do you want to write children's books? Because David Baddiel has been doing it, and it's been obviously very successful. And I thought, I'm not doing it unless I have an idea, and then that idea happened. At that point, I thought, actually, there's an interesting thing about children's books, which is they are, of the genres that I'm talking about, the most story-led. Story itself, if you call it plot, is maybe the most downgraded thing in the critical imagination of literature. People think that mood and texture and prose and character is more important. I really love story. I love seeing brilliant stories. One of the things I love in films is when the story, like it is in Don't Look Now, like it is in Arrival, the story is the central thing about it. And so I worried I wouldn't be able to come up with other things, but then I seem to be able to do that. I seem to be able to, I don't know how much more I can, because I've done 9 of them now, and I might be running out of them, but I mean, this one that I brought here is, well, I wanted to read this partly because I thought this would be related to what I read earlier, because it's another version in a way of the same scene, not exactly, but also it's an example of how cross boundaries, I think, I'm interested in being as a writer, because this is from it's a book called Head Kid, it's totally a children's story, it's got a massive plot device at the centre of it, and the plot device is that a school called Bracket Wood, where I set all my children's stories, is a failing state school, and it's about to have an Ofsted examination, which means it's probably going to be shut down, and they get in a crack head teacher to sort it out, called Mr. Carter. But unfortunately, just at the point that he starts doing it, he swaps bodies. It's a body swap thing with the naughtiest boy in the school, who's called Ryan Ward. And so now Ryan Ward is in the body of Mr. Carter and vice versa. The subplot is that Mr. Carter's real mum, who's called Grace, is dying in a hospice. And so I wanted to read you that bit, because I hadn't thought about it for ages, and I thought it was interesting to know what I'm saying. There's a bit where Ryan, who is in Mr. Carter's body, so he's referred to as Mr. Carter throughout, has to go and see his dying mum. It's not his dying mum, it's Mr. Carter's dying mum, but he gets a message on Mr. Carter's phone and he feels he should go. Mr. Carter nodded, but inside Ryan was nervous. Mrs. Carter sounded sicker than he'd realised. Plus the idea of anyone being pleased to see Mr. Carter seemed weird. In fact, the idea of Mr. Carter having a mum, of any teacher having a mum or dad, had never really occurred to him before. But there it was, a sign on the outside of the door, Grace Carter. Quietly, Zadie the nurse opened the door. Inside was a pleasant room all painted in white, with a view of a garden through the window. At the far end of the room stood a bed. In it, propped up a little by pillows, was an old lady asleep. She had white hair and a sweet face. You wouldn't have known she was ill, except for a tube that went from a machine at the side of the bed into her nose. I'll leave you, just call if you need anything, said Zadie, shutting the door. Don't, Mr. Carter wanted to say. Don't leave. But he was stuck, being an adult, being more of an adult than it had to be so far, and so he just nodded. He went over to the bed. Grace Carter was breathing in a shallow way. As he sat down on the chair next to the bed, her eyes half open. She smiled and frowned at the same time, as if the smiling caused her some pain. "Michael," she said, "how nice of you to come." "Michael," thought Mr. Carter. "Who's Michael?" Then he realised, "Oh, it's me." "Well, Mr. Carter." That's okay," he said uncertainly. Then more uncertainly, "How are you?" She smiled again and frowned again. "You know, I've been better, but mustn't complain." "Well, you could." She opened her eyes a bit more. "Pardon? I'm just saying, if I were you, I'd be complaining a lot. I always complain when I'm ill. He was about to say Mum says, and then remembered that would sound strange. Grace shook her head, but continued to smile. "Not really, Michael. You were always very stoic." "Stoic?" "Yes, when you were ill, which was quite a lot when you were little. You would always just sit there and hardly ask for anything. It was all I could do to get you to stay off school." "Oh, right, yeah, I forgot." Grace carried on looking at him. Then she said, "You know, darling, now that we're talking about all that, about things in the past, I don't want to leave too many things left unsaid." "Right," he said, not really understanding what this meant. "I think that happens a lot, you know, at times like these, when maybe there isn't much time left and then people, they regret it. They regret what they didn't say." "Right. And I think Dad, when he was alive, maybe encouraged you to be a little, you know, stiff upper lip and all that. To not really say how you feel, because he wasn't very comfy, was he, with feelings? And I wouldn't want you to be like that, to think you couldn't say how you feel." "Okay. Because even though you are like your father in many ways, in some other ways, like when I look at you now, I can see the little boy inside you. The little boy you once were. He's still there, I think, even though he's forced to wear this big, stern, grown-up suit of armour of a body the whole time." She stretched out and he took her hand in his. It was thin and light but warm. She was looking at him more closely now. "Michael, are you crying?" "Am I?" He realised he was. "Oh dear, I'm sorry. You never cry." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the one that wasn't holding hers, and sniffed. "Sorry." "No, it's okay, Michael, really. That's exactly what I'm talking about." She paused, still smiling, but a tear, just one, dropped slowly from her right eye, shining down her cheek. "I'm glad, really." She squeezed his hand. "Hello," said Zadie, coming softly into the room. "Sorry, Grace, Michael, but it's time for Grace to have some of her pain-killing medication." Mr. Carter looked round. Grace let go of his hand. She nodded. "You better go, darling. Thank you so much for coming. I know you have a lot of work to do." He nodded and got up. Zadie went round the other side of Grace and started preparing a syringe. "Especially with the new school. How's it going?" Said Mr. Carter, putting his coat back on. "Well, actually, it might get closed down if we fail the inspection, which is in 6 days' time." "You think you can turn it round?" she asked. He said again. This was a tough one, but all at once it came to him, to Ryan Wall, inside the body of Michael Carter, the head teacher of Brackenwood School. He knew exactly what to say. "Listen, Mum, don't you worry about that. That's my problem." And he walked out the door.
It's interesting.
I really went halfway through that.
Well, but it's interesting, both of the passages that you chose are about ageing, but they're for very different audiences. And I wonder whether you think tackling the subject changes according to the audience that you've got in mind, or is it that the same story can just be mapped onto different genres, different audiences, if it's a strong enough story?
I don't know. I mean, no, I think that obviously I don't recognise the boundaries between storytelling, but obviously you also have to think a bit about the genre that you're working in. I think the basic urge to tell the story should be there and concrete, and that's, I think, in there if you can tell a story. But then obviously you do have to think about it. Having said that, the key thing is not particularly in that scene, because it's a sad scene, but when I started writing children's books, one of the key things for me was comedy, because I thought, I've noticed this about my children, who were sort of 8 and 10 at the time, which is they were much funnier than me when I was a kid. And I'll tell you why that is. It's because when I was a kid, on telly, there was the Magic Roundabout for kids. That was it. And young people won't know what that is, but it was just a weird, druggy, odd thing that was on telly for another program called Nationwide. And now, my children have grown up watching the funniest stuff in the world. And I don't mean the funniest stuff for children, I mean the funniest stuff in the world, by which I mean The Simpsons and Pixar films and The Amazing World of Gumball, which is incredible. I don't know if anyone's watched Amazing World of Gumball, but it's so genuinely funny and experimental and incredible, which meant that by the age of about 6 or 7, both my son and my daughter were hilarious. And not just hilarious in all the things they say. I mean, they understood irony, they understood so I thought, comically, I'm not going to talk down to children when I write children's books, and that's, I think, one reason why they've been a success. Obviously, I don't swear in them, do occasionally, but not much, and there's not much about sex and drugs. But otherwise, it's essentially the same instinct, the same entertaining instinct, I guess, that's in any other book.
At this stage, I'd ask if you have questions, could you pass them along to the end of this work, and then some of the helpers will pick up the questions and bring them here. While that's happening, can I just ask one final thing, which is that we talked about the many different kinds of projects that you often juggle. So what's next?
I'm doing another kids book, which is about a kid who wants to be a chef, but he's in his chef's burger van, and he starts making brilliant burgers, but then the sort of McDonald's-like chain wants to shut him down. So I've written that. I've written a memoir, which isn't really a memoir. It's entirely based on my family show. So actually, there's an interesting moment in it where I start talking about my early life in comedy, and there's some funny stories there. But I found myself thinking this is turning into a showbiz memoir, and I don't want it to be that. So I stop it and go back to talking about what it's really about, which is the very great weirdness of my childhood. So I'm doing that. I mean, I'm doing a podcast, which hasn't come out yet, and we haven't quite worked out what it is, but with Baroness Sayeeda Warsi. So Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, you know, she's in the Conservative Party, but she's a prominent Muslim, and we were put together. This wasn't my idea. It's quite unusual for me to do something that's someone else's idea, but it was a good idea to try and find areas of communality between Jews and Muslims, and try and find a way through how to talk to each other in the present moment. And it's funny and it's interesting or whatever, and that feels to me like a really interesting thing to do.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions here,
Right.
Some of which we might have touched on already if they were written before we started talking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read these out pretty fast, and we're going to have a rapid fire answer. So
Are they like general knowledge questions?
Yeah. Your time starts now. Baddiel and Skinner on Plan was a rare example of comedians having the confidence to improvise on TV. Do you think media should find more ways to enable that level of freedom?
So Baddiel and Skinner on Plan, for anyone who didn't see it, was a show. Actually, what happened was Frank said to me one day, do you want to do Edinburgh? And I said, oh, we're too old, which was ages ago, to do Edinburgh. And he said, come on. I said, okay, we'll do it if we could just go on stage without having prepared anything and just say what we want to talk about to an audience. And he said, okay, fine. I didn't think he'd say yes. And we did it, and it was a success in Edinburgh. And then we ended up doing 5 series of it on ITV. Some shows were better than others, to be honest, but some were really funny. But what interested me, I don't know if this answers the question, I'll try and answer it, was that I really find the idea of not being me difficult. I like to be as much me, I'm sort of wearying so sometimes, as possible. That idea that's in J. Alfred Prufrock of finding a face to meet the faces that you meet, I can't do that. I really can't do it. And so I'm always interested as a performer in how I can be as authentic as possible. And that show stripped away everything, and so allowed me to do that. And when it was good, it was really good. I don't know that there's been that much like it, and I'm not sure that most TV companies would want to do that.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Next one. Was there ever a time in your life when comedy let you down?
Oh yeah, when it went wrong with me. I'll tell you one thing, an interesting thing actually, which is, I had this, I didn't have that many bad gigs, but when I was a stand-up, but occasionally I would, at a comedy store particularly, which was a bit of a bear pit when I was first doing it. And I remember once it going really badly, and just hearing the voices, and a man had heard a voice shout, "The walls are closing in." Thinking, that's God, isn't it? That's God speaking to me, even though I don't believe it, and then leaving the stage. But then I remember I told the story, and this rebounded on me in a bad way, of what I think was, I mean, it's a horrible heckle. I do think it's one of the best heckles I've ever heard. But it didn't actually happen to me. I was watching an open spot at the comedy store, and he was very bad. He was called Cynical Sid, and he was very bad. The fact that he had a silly name was part of the problem. And I was watching, and lots of shouting was happening, and then a man at the back just said, "Everybody hates you. Everybody hates you. You must know from school." And I remember thinking, that's appalling. But I ended up talking about it, and then people thought it happened to me, which slightly annoyed me. But no, I mean, I'm very, comedy, even as I go on to do stuff that isn't comedy, remains incredibly important to me. Probably the things that I most love will always be comedy.
Okay. What qualities do you think makes a good storyteller?
Well, I sort of hope I've answered a bit of that. I think the primary thing, which I said earlier, is to feel what is it about my life, what is it about my experience that I can translate into story that will, paradoxically, the more specific you are, the more hopefully it will chime in a universal way. I personally think the way to write, lots of people disagree with this, Rodney Doyle once said to me that he works out every single beat of his stories before he even starts writing. I don't do that. I have trust in the idea, and I improvise the first 40 pages, and then always I think, oh, what now? And then what happens is, out of the mist of what I've written so far, I get an ending, and then I start to change the beginning as a result of the ending. And so I think that for me, that kind of fluidity of ideas, based on the fact that you have trust in the original story idea, is very important to me.
It seems that writing on Jewish topics can sometimes remain within the Jewish community. When you write about anti-Semitism, who's your intended audience, and how do you reach them, especially if they're not Jewish?
Well, actually, weirdly, Jews Don't Count has managed to do that. I can only talk empirically, but it's sold more copies than there are Jews in Britain. So there must be at least 5 Jews who have read it. But what I hope about Jews Don't Count is it has shifted the dial a tiny bit on the conversation about Jews not being allowed into that conversation. What I would say is, it's an interesting thing actually, is that not every Jewish person, some Jews don't like it, but a lot of Jews have written to me since that book came out to essentially say that I was articulating something that they all felt and no one had quite said it. But I would say that they are, although there's an act of solidarity there, they are not the target of the book. The target of the book are what I would call white Christian progressives who ally, in a good way, with minorities but somehow don't with Jews. And occasionally I do get someone writing to me and telling me exactly what the book needs to do has happened. Obviously I also get people writing horrible stuff, but I got one guy who said on social media that he was a progressive and he'd always thought of himself as an anti-racist and had never thought that he could have any kind of racist ideas in his head. And then he said, and then I read your book and I realised that I share quite a lot of the assumptions that you're pointing to, the stereotypical assumptions you're pointing to about Jews. And I hadn't thought that they were racist assumptions. And then he said this brilliant thing. He said, I now realise that anti-Semitism is the racism that slips past you. And that is true. It's not as obvious as other forms of discrimination, perhaps. And it sort of can be quite hard to see, it can be quite elusive. And so I think if it's a primer for people like that to understand it, then that's useful.
Final question, trick question. How many lines are on a shirt?
How is it a trick question? If I say 3, that's obviously the answer, but it's not correct.
Well, I don't know.
I thought you knew the answer.
Well, I'm hoping it's 3.
Who did that question? Right, so how am I wrong? Is it 3?
Short song.
7. No, thank you. I think it's 3. Although I was reading Unruly by David Mitchell, the second time I brought him up, David Mitchell, and apparently the 3 lions were created by Richard the Lionheart, and they refer, did anyone know this? I didn't know this, so history people, they refer to, one of them was sort of British, the other 2 are French, because he thought he was King of France, like a lot of British kings did. So one of them is Normandy and one of them is Aquitaine. So in terms of actual English lions, there's 1.
David Baddiel, thank you.
Thank you very much.